This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. From streaming to shopping, Prime helps you get more out of your passions. So whether you're a fan of true crime or prefer a nail-biting novel from time to time, with services like Prime Video, Amazon Music, and fast free delivery, Prime makes it easy to get more out of whatever you're into or getting into. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to learn more.
Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon. We have a very honored guest once again. We have the great Katherine Bayford. Hello, Katherine. How are you?
Hello, I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Very good, very good. For those who are not familiar with Katherine, she is a huge name in the Napoleonic circle, and we love talking to her. And she's also working on a biography of the Bonaparte family called, quote, The Bonapartes, which should be very interesting once it comes out. You can also find her on X, Twitter, at KEBAYF. If you'd like to follow her channel, she has some good content up there, and we're happy to have her. Speaking of the Bonapartes, who are we talking about today, Katherine?
We're talking about Caroline Bonaparte today. He has a very mixed reputation in Bonaparte circles, I think.
Yeah, we were talking about this kind of offline, and maybe we'll talk about this in the legacy. History hasn't been kind to her. They just kind of portray her as this like money-grubbing, power-grubbing sibling of Napoleon. But I think there was another side to her, don't you? That she was kind of a deft political operator.
Yeah, most definitely. Almost a bit too deft at points, maybe. Yes, absolutely. I'm sure we'll get to this in a bit.
Yeah, indeed. Well, we'll dive into her biography. Caroline was born in March 1782 in Corsica. She was the seventh child and third daughter of the Bonaparte family. And as Napoleon famously states, quote, "Of all my family, she is the one that resembles me the most," end quote. What was her upbringing like?
Well, firstly, and this is something which I'm sure I'll return to in the podcast, Napoleon can be a little bit sexist. He thinks that a woman's place is primarily in the home, even by the standards of the day. You know, France has gone through Enlightenment, it's gone through revolution. Napoleon's seen as quite a fuddy-duddy, even by the standards. The fact that he thinks this of Caroline and says it publicly is a real tribute to her. If anything, you know, he's going to be understating this somewhat.
Yes. I can't even tell if it's a compliment. Like, is he saying that? Like, is that a dig on Caroline? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, quite possibly, actually. But yes, Caroline is also born in Corsica, as all of them are, but she's born just a little bit later. She's the seventh child. She's not exactly the baby of the family, but she's certainly like very young. And as such, she's a little bit spoiled. You know, this is a general trend within the Bonaparte siblings, is that perhaps the older ones tend to have gone through the ringer a bit in youth, come out the other side, and had to really craft something for themselves. So, of course, the most successful one of these by far is Napoleon. You get this real sense, especially with people like Joseph, that they're having to work at things, they're interesting political operatives. With some of the younger ones, you know, your Pauline, your Caroline, your Jerome's, these are people who a lot of people think, okay, well, you're parvenus, but perhaps these ones have almost been handed everything on a plate, for better or for worse. So she's born Maria Annunziata. You know, they all have very Italian, kind of Catholic names. And all of them adopt these sort of Francophone names so that they don't seem like, as I say, these sort of Italian, Corsican minor nobility parvenus.
And you wonder, too, like Napoleon and Joseph, and even Lucien to a bit, they had some time on Corsica to grow up and run around on the hills and have their father around for a longer time than the younger ones. So they had probably more stability than the younger ones. The younger ones, their father dies not long after. They lose a lot of their money. They have to flee Corsica. So I think there's more turmoil in the younger ones' lives than the older ones, perhaps. I don't know. I don't know if that affects their personality or not.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of turmoil, but it happens at a stage in which they're young enough that they're not able to fix this. There's no responsibility for this on their shoulders. Napoleon, Joseph, they're acutely aware of the terrible situation that the family's in. Their father dies. This is obviously a nightmare in and of itself. Some of his investments go very bad. The family's in a terrible way. They're being considered traitors from a number of different political stances. And there's this real sense that the older ones are absolutely terrified. This is a kind of make or break situation. Whereas the younger ones, yes, they have a terrible, terrible time of it when they're very young. But the other members of the family manage to sort this out and create a more prosperous life than they could have ever expected.
That's an excellent point. The older ones have to fix it and solve it. The younger ones just kind of have to, the older brothers will fix it. I don't have to worry about anything. And that kind of maybe seeps into their personality.
Yeah, and I think also there's some very real and justified sympathy from the older siblings and from the mother and so on, for especially the younger ones. It's like, my poor baby growing up in this kind of absolutely terrible condition. And so even people like Napoleon and Josephine, who aren't exactly the softest of people, grow up with a real soft spot for some of these individuals and maybe let them get away with a lot more than they would do some of the older siblings.
That's a good point. Well, in 1793, she moves, or some people say flees, with her family to France. And she's educated there. What was her education like?
Yeah, so again, she goes to quite an expensive all-girls school. It's run by one of Marie Antoinette's former ladies-in-waiting. It's all very sophisticated. This is a very real and obvious attempt by some of the new members of a post-revolutionary society to grant their daughters a real sense of almost old Versailles era status. It's quite shameless, really. You do away with the aristocracy and then you kind of amass all of their trappings in some ways. Now the problem that Caroline has whilst at this school is that she's perfectly pretty and she's a very clever young woman, and she'll continue to be very clever and very pretty, but she's not really an intellectual, whereas Hortense, for instance, kind of puts her to shame on these sorts of things. So there's one very embarrassing instance for the young Caroline where I think she's kind of handed a letter to read out at the table and really, really struggles with this to the point where it becomes embarrassing, at which point Napoleon sort of takes it off her and says, just give it to Hortense, she can do it.
Right, and that's Josephine's daughter, who also went to that same school.
Absolutely.
Well, in 1797, Caroline meets the dashing figure that is the future Marshal Murat. Why do you think these two were an intriguing match?
They're an intriguing match for a number of different reasons. The first is that Caroline's very young. She's 17. Murat, on the other hand, is in his 30s. He's absolutely gorgeous. He has this gorgeous kind of shag of black hair. He's dashing. He's, arguably the bravest and most impressive cavalry officer of his age. He's in many ways kind of integral to Napoleon's military success at various points. And Caroline is, at this point, quite a young, slightly naive girl who is entirely charmed by him and really falls dramatically in love with him. And they have a very, very passionate relationship. Napoleon is not happy with this whatsoever. Murat is known as that madman Murat. Napoleon's well aware of his appetites. He's not the sort of man who you want marrying your younger sister.
He's a ladies' man. Historically, he's a cavalry guy. He's also charging at the head. I mean, Napoleon probably thought this guy's going to last 5 years. He's always charging at the head of some attack. So
he's so brave as to be foolish. And then on top of that, he's like a lot of young, brash military men where it's that sort of work hard, play hard mentality. He'll go out and he'll charge at this sort of terrible, almost kind of suicidal charge. And then he'll kind of get to the end of it and he'll just kind of feast and with immense gluttony and have a huge amount of women and is very lecherous and all of this kind of stuff. And he's on top of this as well, most damningly, he's not from any kind of noble background. He's from a lower middle class background. Napoleon is not impressed. He's at this point, Caroline's been being taught almost Marie Antoinette type manners. He's thinking that she is going to be a future queen. He's going to be able to marry her off to European aristocracy and really cement the Bonapartist cause, both politically as well as militarily.
Yeah, and just like Murat had numerous suitors, I mean, Caroline was sought after by future Marshal Lannes and some others. So, like you mentioned, she was very pretty, she was very desirable, but for better or for worse, she chose Murat. So, as you mentioned before, Caroline was just 17, Murat was 32. They're married in 1800. I know they quickly have a child together, killing Murat, born in 1801. How do you think the marriage started out?
It starts off very passionately. In many ways, this is one of the two things they're bound by. They're bound by this kind of twin excitement at one another, but also ambition. And this will become, again, a very big feature of their marriage. They have 4 children in about as many years. But again, it's a marriage fundamentally built on attraction, which tends to be the sort of marriage which doesn't last particularly long. He's, impulsive, he's somewhat lecherous, he's a real cad. This is something that everyone else in the family can see. They can see exactly the mistake Caroline's making. It's the sort of mistake that a lot of young women make. They desperately want to prevent the marriage from going ahead, but she's absolutely insistent. They're completely in love. No one's going to get in the way. And then, of course, the inevitable happens, and the marriage kind of breaks down in that sort of romantic sense eventually. Right. But they share a lot of qualities of kind of ambition, political ambition, military ambition. Again, she's reasonably similar to Napoleon in these kind of ways. There are some qualities that her husband has that we just don't really know if Caroline has due to the limitations, the necessary limitations of the age. Murat is an immensely brave individual to the point of almost being foolish. Well, we don't know if Caroline has this kind of military bravery in battle because, she's not in battle. She's not allowed to be in battle. But we do know that Caroline has certain qualities that her husband doesn't. One of which is the ability to think and act strategically, and one of which is just a real sense of level-headedness. She's a clever, reasonable individual. She makes political moves for long-term gain and stability for herself, for her husband, and for her family. She operates within the limitations of Napoleonic society and also manages to try to kind of exploit them. Her sister, in contrast, someone like Pauline, sort of almost rams against these. These are limitations she finds unbearable, and she kind of fails within them. Caroline doesn't. She really, really kind of thrives.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. I think she sees kind of life as like a chess match, and you have to do your best to win each battle. I think her biggest battle, one of them, was against Josephine, who she and the rest of the family despised. But in 1803, Murat was military governor of Paris, so he has a lot of power. He buys the Élysée Palace, and of course this is not enough for the ambitious Caroline. But most of her hatred and jealousy was centered on Napoleon's wife, Josephine. Why do you think the Bonaparte family despised her so much?
There's so many reasons. So many reasons. The first is just that they really, at the time in which Napoleon gets married, he isn't yet emperor, but he's clearly a man of immense ability, ambition, and potential. And a lot of the family are sort of turning around to him and sort of saying, her? Really? We really think you can do better here. Josephine is a little bit older than him, yes. She's also a woman with a very poor reputation. She's also a woman who just does not seem to be marrying him out of love. Perhaps all of this could be forgiven or ignored if she was a very dutiful and loving wife, but she's not. She's quite openly carrying on with other people, including after the marriage has occurred. The family sort of absolutely hate this. They're incandescent about it. Napoleon's completely devoted to her. He almost can't see, especially during this early period of marriage, he can't see the faults in Josephine that everyone else can. He's making in some ways the same mistake that Caroline does in her marriage. And on top of that as well, Josephine has 2 children. Now this in and of itself isn't an issue. There are plenty of widows around at this sort of time. It's perfectly reasonable that a man might marry a woman with children. But it's the fact that over time, Napoleon really, really honours these children as if they're his own. And obviously, as he attains more and more political and military power, he starts kind of granting quite prestigious roles and honours to Josephine's children rather than to his own siblings. And this especially is something that Caroline is really, really angry about. When he becomes emperor, for instance, he sort of makes his brothers, princes of the empire, meaning that Caroline's sisters-in-law kind of outrank her, including Josephine's own daughter. And Caroline sort of, she's getting herself in such a state about this that she's crying about this. She's fainting publicly. She's very angry at the time in which the coronation occurs. She's literally yanking on Josephine's cape to try to make her fall over before she's crowned. It's all really kind of petty stuff here.
Yeah, you know what? You just pointed out something. I never really thought about it till you mentioned it. Napoleon famously wanted his siblings to marry other heads of state or other royalty in other countries. I know famously Jerome married an aristocrat in Baltimore. Napoleon said, no, you're marrying who I tell you to marry, divorce her immediately. But they probably turned around and said, well, look who you married. I mean, Josephine was an aristocrat, but she wasn't a head of state or a queen.
No, she's a very low-ranking aristocrat by marriage, essentially, and her husband's dead. This is not a politically beneficial marriage, and this is not lost on the Bonapartes, who feel like they're being press-ganged into miserable marriages and miserable relationships when their brother's not willing to do the same. And so this actually culminates in Lucien, for instance, Napoleon's arguably wildest and least obedient brother, getting married. I think he marries the daughter of an innkeeper. Napoleon's absolutely incandescent about this. Again, he wants him marrying princesses, countesses, people who matter politically. And then when she dies, Lucien marries, the daughter of a tax inspector. And Napoleon's writing to him, absolutely outraged about this. And Lucien writes back and says something like, well, at least my wife isn't old and smelly, unlike Josephine. And, unlike you, at least I had the sense to marry my own mistress and not someone else's. So, yes, this is something which is not lost on the Bonaparte siblings whatsoever. They're really unhappy about it. Josephine does not benefit them politically. She's not an impressive match. She doesn't even seem to love or respect their brother. She doesn't like them at all. She's bad news to them, and they don't like her. Even Napoleon's own mother, who's turning around to him and saying, look, if you're happy, I'm happy, that's all I need, is turning around in private conversation and referring to Josephine as that whore. No one likes her.
Yeah, and that's a soap opera and probably makes for a good book, which you're writing. But also you mentioned, Hortense and Eugene. They're kind of everything that the Bonaparte sibling are not. They are hardworking, they're nice, they're capable, and they're loyal. And, and we'll come back to the loyalty thing with Caroline, but maybe that's why there was some antagonism there or hatred, because the Bonapartes are looking at these children of Josephine, and they're like, wow, they're so well put together, and Napoleon dotes on them. And they just were everything that the others were not.
Yeah, and they're also everything that Josephine is not. Again, they're loyal, they're intelligent, they're very loving, they're very capable. They really kind of embarrass the Bonaparte siblings in a lot of ways. And as such, at one point Napoleon's turning around to Joseph and then to Louis, and he's saying, if you kind of renounce succession rights to France, I'll put you in as king of Italy. And they're turning around saying, no, no way, we're entitled to France. Not able to manipulate the situation very well whatsoever. Well, he gives it to Eugene. There's, again, Caroline is embarrassed by Hortense. Hortense is just the kind of darling of this new society. We've talked about the fact that, revolutionary France, people are quite free sexually, everything's very radical. When Napoleon comes in, it's not quite like Victoria after the Georgians. Again, society becomes a little bit more conservative. And Hortense is the darling of this new society. She's wonderful. Everyone but her husband loves her. They think she's so intelligent. She's so wonderful. She's so clever. And Caroline, again, just it's a little bit of armchair psychology, but she seems to harbour just an immense amount of resentment to Josephine and to Josephine's children, especially.
Yeah, I mean, Hortense, she's a composer of music. She's good at billiards. People adore her parties. And I could see why that would just bring out some jealousy in Caroline. Well, in 1808, Caroline finally receives the honor she's been questing for, a queen's crown. She and Murat are made king and queen of Naples in southern Italy. How does Caroline perform in this role?
Yeah, Caroline performs very well. This role is also granted to her and her husband due to a lot of machinations on her behalf. She's lobbying for this. She wants this. She knows what she wants to be. She wants to be head of state. She wants her own country. She's desperately trying to attain this for a long period of time. And there's this real sense as well, the marriage between Caroline and her husband breaks down. Murat is off, he might be sleeping with this young noble woman of easy virtue, or he might be sleeping with this maid or this bar wench or whoever it might be. With Caroline, it always feels like she's choosing politically important men. So, for instance, Metternich's walking around European society quite openly wearing a bracelet made with her hair, because... She's having affairs with Talleyrand's son. She's having affairs with diplomats, with generals. These are important men. She's always out kind of building a better life for herself and incidentally for her husband. They are a political unit together. And unlike some of her siblings who are willing to allow a marriage to implode, such as, for instance, Pauline, she's very, very willing to keep it together for political reasons, so as to best further both of their positions.
So her and Murat often quarreled with each other, and both were unfaithful to each other. I know Napoleon's other brother, Louis, famously got separated and divorced from Hortense after a tumultuous marriage. Why do you think Murat and Caroline, I mean, like you said, Caroline's cheating on him with General Junot and Metternich. Murat is cheating on her whenever he gets a chance. Why do you think they stay together?
Well, firstly, I think it's important to note, you can look at the divorce rates within the Napoleonic children and almost come to an incorrect conclusion that divorce is relatively common. Napoleon and Josephine divorced. Were they divorce for arguably one very particular reason? Hortense and Louis divorce. Were they divorced because he is so egregiously awful as a husband that it's a literally untenable marriage and untenable relationship? Murat and Caroline aren't necessarily happy together. They're not necessarily in love, but it's not a total nightmare to the point where they have to sever their marriage. They're still politically a unit. She's writing to Murat, essentially saying, why are you messing things up for us? You're making these kind of terrible decisions. You're alienating the emperor. Don't you see we have to essentially be able to manipulate him. We have to play by his rules so that he grants us what we want. She's always, always, always level-headed and thinking politically in a long-term way.
Yeah, you wonder, if they almost had an agreement with each other, look, we have more influence together than we do separated, so let's just do what we can to stay together. And you're right, unlike Louis and Hortense, who couldn't stand the sight of each other, I think they they still actually liked being around each other.
Yeah, they still get on perfectly well, and they're just stronger together as a team than they are individually. So, if the passion's not still there, if, the love no longer remains, it doesn't really matter. Caroline is fundamentally a kind of political animal at this point.
Yeah, agreed. Well, speaking of her political acumen, in 1812, Murat leaves Naples to join Napoleon for 6 months for the famously disastrous invasion of Russia. So Caroline's kind of like queen regent. She's running the show in Naples. How does she govern in his absence?
She's pretty superb. Her ministers are really impressed. Diplomats are really impressed. Officials are very impressed. Staff are very impressed. I think that her nanny even kind of makes a statement that Caroline's so bound up in political issues in Naples that she forgets to even inquire, let alone try and visit, but to inquire about her children for about a fortnight or so. She's primarily concerned with the political, and now's her opportunity to really show this off and to shine.
Yeah, I've read that. Like the ministers were impressed. She held daily meetings. She was really involved heavily with the running of Naples and did a good job from all accounts. In 1813, Caroline and Murat began to see the writing on the wall that Napoleon's defeat is inevitable. And they begin to have alliance talks with the Allies to save their throne. Do you think this was the right move for the couple?
I mean, the right move is sort of difficult to pin down, but a couple of things become obvious relatively soon. The first is that Caroline and her husband have made the decision in order to betray her brother because Caroline sees that the writing is on the wall. She thinks the entire thing's over. This is it. We don't want to go down on a kind of sinking ship here. Now, she's reasonably confident in this decision and pretty unrepentant about the entire thing. But Murat, on the other hand, starts having some second thoughts. He starts feeling guilty. He starts feeling like maybe he's betrayed the great benefactor, the man who's made him the man he is, not unjustifiably, I think. And so Murat ends up kind of double-crossing the original double cross and going back to Napoleon. Now, this is most definitely a mistake, because at this point, you're sort of alienating both sides in many ways. And now this in itself will be a bit of a disaster, which I'm sure we'll get to. But Napoleon absolutely blames his sister for this. He's turning around and he's saying, yeah, okay, Murat is impulsive, he's foolish, he's really quite cowardly when he's not on the battlefield. I'm very, very angry with him. But this is your fault. You're the one that made the decision here. I know what's happened here. I don't forgive you for this. You need to come back into the fold, basically.
And it's easy for you and I to, and historians, hindsight 2020, be like, oh, that was the wrong move. They shouldn't have done that. But like you said, things were looking bad for Napoleon. They want to save their throne. They want to save their future.
I mean, again, David Chandler thinks that at this period in time, not all is lost for Napoleon. I happen to agree with this. This certainly doesn't help Napoleon's cause, though. Yeah. This the point in which you start hemorrhaging top generals and officials and allies and so on, it's very, very, very difficult to recover. This is one of the reasons why the betrayal is so devastating to Napoleon. And another thing which I think maybe Caroline's aware of and just thinks, look, I just have to work with what I'm given here, but is the issue that, Murat and his wife are not old aristocracy. So they're turning around to the Allies and they're saying, look, allow us to retain Naples and we'll help you out here and blah, 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 blah. But when everything's lost for them in the end, it's kind of a different story. The Allies feel no real loyalty to them. They don't really like them. They're not, part of a dynasty or lineage which is kind of intermarried and intermingled with European aristocracy for half a millennium or so. The kind of nouveau riche, and worse, the nouveau aristocratic, which makes it very, very easy for them to be dismissed after the fall of Napoleon.
That's a really good point. They are kind of nouveau rich, and they're not from the ancient houses of Europe. So yeah, that's a fine point.
There's a period around this time, maybe a little bit before, in which Caroline's having a portrait made of her, and she's consistently late. And at one point, she turns up and she's wearing an entirely different hairstyle, an entirely different dress. So the artist has to kind of chip away at the hair that he's kind of made and completely restructure the painting, and is very, very annoyed at this. And they turn around publicly in front of Caroline and say, I've painted real princesses that have never been so rude. There's there's a real feeling like maybe you shouldn't push this too far.
Right. Don't let your titles go to your head. Yeah.
These titles are granted by someone else and someone else's achievements.
I remember Marshal Davout was obviously annoyed with Murat throughout the empire, but on the retreat in Russia, he said, look, you're only a king because of Napoleon. Like, Don't let this go to your head what that you're king of Naples. You're only because Napoleon made you that, and I think that always bothered probably Murat and Caroline.
Yeah, and there's something quite noble in the way that a captain goes down with his ship. If Napoleon made you, then maybe you go down with Napoleon.
You mentioned Eugene earlier, like the Allies made him all kinds of offers. Like, look, you can be king of Italy if you just switch sides. And he wouldn't.
And he doesn't do it. And again, this is something which you can imagine just the other Bonaparte family members are not particularly happy with, especially people like Caroline. This is just kind of an embarrassment to them. He's so loyal, he's so loving, and he actually gains a huge amount more respect. And so you end up, for instance, at the Congress of Vienna, and the Tsar is absolutely delighted with Eugene. Even Castlereagh turns around and calls him the best of the Bonaparte school. He gains a huge amount of respect from people precisely for having principles. Whereas, in contrast, someone like Murat is just kind of a wild card, is dangerous, is not loyal, is not respectable. Do you really owe him anything? There's quite a damning moment at the Congress, for instance, where people sort of raise his name and they say, "Oh, what do we do about Murat? How difficult?" And Talleyrand sort of turns around after a moment of silence and says, "We know no king of Naples," and that's it.
Well, it's funny you mention that, because you're right. I mean, in early 1814, Murat joins the Allies, leads forces against Prince Eugene and the French army in Italy. And it does save the throne for a little while, basically a couple months. But
at a cost of great dishonor.
And meanwhile, he's sending secret letters to Napoleon on Elba, like, what should I do? He just seems to change his mind a lot. And I don't know if that's Caroline's machinations or what's going on there.
If anything, Caroline is quite angry at him for changing his mind so often. So Caroline has made the decision, that the victors are going to be the Allies, and therefore they're going to ally themselves with the Allies. Whereas Murat is a kind of weak, vacillating person. Napoleon's always thought this. Napoleon turns around, a good decade before and says, well, the thing is, when Murat's in battle, he's the bravest man you'll ever know. But if you actually get him to make a decision, he's terrible, he's cowardly, he wants to please everyone, he's going backwards and forwards. Napoleon can see the issues with Murat and with his personality long before they begin to manifest in such a damaging way.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
Well, in 1815, Murat rallies to Napoleon's side once again and launches an ill-advised attack against Austria. He ultimately loses the campaign, and he and Caroline have to give up their thrones and flee. And then shortly after Napoleon's final downfall at Waterloo, Murat launches a futile attempt to recapture his throne in Naples, but is quickly captured and shot by a firing squad. And, this episode is about Caroline. Do you think Caroline mourned him, or was she like, what was this guy doing?
Yeah, it's such an ignominious death too. It's so pointless. It's so embarrassing. He's shot and given a slightly dignified death, but he has to be rescued from a crowd, trying to lynch him. This is not a good way to go for a former king. Caroline's certainly in shock, especially with the manner of which he died. When she gets news of this, she's is quite overcome. She seems to have a mild, almost nervous breakdown quite briefly. But I don't know that she necessarily mourns him per se. The marriage is long gone. They've remained together, as I say, as a kind of political unit, but the romantic element of it, she's no longer that 17-year-old girl who's madly in love with this dashing, gorgeous man. She sees that she's married to a bit of a fool. She's a woman in her 30s. She has 4 children, and she has the future to think about here. Again, she's constantly plotting, what is the next stage going to be, and just why is he kind of continually ruining my plans? There's almost a slight sense of relief, I think, when he's gone.
It's obviously sad they have children together, so I'm sure that the children mourned him, and I think they threw him into a common grave. Like, they can't even go visit his grave. So you're right, it's a very unnoble way to die. So what becomes of Caroline after 1815? I know her mother famously refuses to ever see or talk to her again.
Yes, so Madame Mère, Napoleon's mother, is perhaps the member of family who remains just entirely loyal to him. She's done everything he's asked of her. She remains very, very level-headed. She's immensely defensive of her son, and she's incredibly disappointed in Caroline for betraying him, for not visiting him, for not loving it. She doesn't even want to speak to her again. Caroline ends up settling in the south, just to the south of Vienna, and again takes up a kind of eventually a morganatic marriage. She actually styles herself as like the Countess of Lapona, which is obviously Napoli. It's all a little bit shameless, and she becomes in many ways quite a distasteful person. So, for instance, when her mother dies, her sons end up, I think her daughters end up marrying into minor aristocracy, and her sons end up in America, like everyone moving to America at the time, just desperately needing money. And so when her mother dies, she ends up in quite a gauche way, really fighting for a huge amount of the estate, to the point where it becomes embarrassing enough that Joseph just signs over his portion of it to her so that she won't go to the press and make a big fuss about the whole thing. So again, this is a woman who is impressing everyone whilst her husband was away at war with how brilliant a stateswoman she was. And she ends up sort of scrabbling in late middle age over, her mother's estate.
Clearly didn't save money for a rainy day. Yeah.
Many such cases at this point with the Bonapartes.
Yeah. Well, she dies in 1839 in Florence, Italy, oddly enough, of stomach cancer, which is the same disease that killed her famous brother. What do you think her legacy is? And it's kind of like we talked about at the beginning. Was she a shrewd operator and deft politician, or was she just a greedy Machiavellian character who only cared about herself and her titles?
Yes, so Napoleon, as you say, comes to a kind of conclusion with Caroline, whether this is a compliment or not, that unlike most women, Caroline is possessed of a strong masculine understanding and talent superior to the generality of her sex. But he finishes that quote by saying, however, there's no accounting for the actions of a woman. She still sort of makes mistakes and therefore betrays me. She's still fundamentally an illogical lady. Napoleon and people around her certainly think that she is just immensely ambitious, which she is. As we've said before, she's not able to really test this ambition in the way that a man at the time would, by going out and fighting certain battles. She has to try to win territory or win titles of herself through manipulating other people, whether this is through relationships, sexual relationships, or sort of fraternal relationships. She's a woman who ends up or who goes from being a sort of young, slightly girlish teenager who can be a bit embarrassed and maybe feel a little bit overlooked, to a political operator of incredible success who can also really feel like she's looked over in favor of other people, usually the same person, that being Hortense. In many ways, there's a kind of great shame with Caroline, because, as we've said before, right at the beginning, she's part of the kind of slightly spoiled latter Bonaparte children. And she seems to almost kind of exist in this really uncomfortable, slightly corrupting mishmash of power in her life. Half of which she's kind of born into and therefore given a huge amount on a plate by her brother, and the other half of which she's having to really attain and work for and kind of almost corrupt herself in the process, culminating in, of course, in her actually betraying her brother. So in some ways it's a great shame, but she's certainly a woman, unlike a huge amount at the time, who is just driven by an obvious quest for power.
Yeah. You wonder, like, if she styled herself to be like Catherine the Great or Elizabeth I, but just wasn't willing to do the hard work, like do well in school or be loyal to your family or be a good human. Like, she wanted to be great and be this leader like her brother and have lots of power, but she wasn't willing to put in the work or do the little things that would make you that.
I also think that while she was, certainly interesting, both in and of herself and also by the standards of the age, she wasn't innately brilliant. She wasn't Napoleon.
Right.
She was a successful, interesting, intelligent individual. But she certainly wasn't, a neo Alexander the Great like her brother. And sort of natural limitations there that perhaps she didn't really appreciate. And so, could she have been a Catherine the Great? Maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe she just wasn't quite as brilliant as the kind of people she was aspiring to be.
Yeah, it's an interesting legacy. You hate to just paint with a brush. Oh, she was just this ungrateful, spoiled brat. Because I think there's more to her than that. But it's just the way she ended up that it looked like that. Her husband gets killed. She betrays her brother. She's fighting with her brothers over her mom's inheritance. It's bad optics looking back on it.
There's that kind of classic Dostoevsky quote, right, where he says something like, the greatest tragedy of all is that you've betrayed yourself, and for what? Nothing. Caroline betrays her family, she betrays the political system that made her. For what? So that she can, style herself as an anagram of her former country. Yeah. It's a real tragedy, and ultimately, I think, puts her much more on the level of some of her slightly more ineffectual brothers, such as Jerome Bonaparte, than it does Napoleon.
Well, thank you for that, Catherine. That was great. Again, Catherine's working on a great biography. I cannot wait to read it on the Bonaparte family called The Bonapartes. And you can find her on Twitter at KEBAYF. And I highly recommend you follow her channel there. Catherine, it was an absolute pleasure.
It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.